American country was settled for food. Sure, I know that you've been taught, and correctly so, that people came to America for freedom, and indeed they did. But they also came for food. They came for the bounteous wonder of our agricultural production. Throughout the country and throughout our history, agriculture has defined America. We have bounteous foods. We have a tremendous agricultural production. We have amber waves of grain and fruited plain. I'm sure you're familiar with all of that. And throughout our history, America has been defined by apple pie. This has been a tremendous food, this has been a tremendous bounty of food, a cornucopia. And that's really the reason why America was settled. That and our technological prowess. So when we think about America, and when we think about our food, what we should think about first and foremost is fresh ingredients, fresh off the farm. And we should think about home-cooked meals, meals that are prepared by women who love what they do. And in fact, if we think about this apple pie and this picture that we have of the United States as being a cornucopia of agricultural and food plenty, when we think of this apple pie as representing America, we should also think about the women who have cooked this food for us. And this image of America that we have is defined by the women who have cooked by instinct and with love throughout American history. And women have told researchers as late as the 1940s that cooking is their favorite part of their job. Not cleaning, not laundry, not ironing, not doing the washing up, and not even childcare, but cooking. And cooking is so important because it speaks to all of us. Our food culture is what binds us together. It's a human connection that we have with each other. Unfortunately, that connection is dying, and our food culture is largely dead. The American cuisine that was once really the pride of the continent, the pride of the world, that is now dead. Now, this transformation did not happen overnight. It started decades and decades ago. It started when the delicious foods that were promoted, cooked, were replaced by processed foods. Things that were easy to put on the table, things that could be made in an instant. And this was the decline of the American diet because it was the decline of cooking and it was the decline of the connection, of that personal, emotional connection between the people doing the cooking and the people doing the eating, even if it's the same person. And so it's been an unhappy development. Now I know what you're thinking. You're thinking, the American diet can't be dead. The American diet is alive and well. I mean, it must be just the other day I had a delicious pasta salad with sardines and orange marinated beets with toasted pistachios and pickled shallots. Well, sure, of course you did. And the reason you remember that is because it was special, because it was unique. It used to be that that kind of eating was commonplace. It used to be that that kind of eating was the default. But it's no longer the default. Those days are gone. Instead, what we have as the default is something like this. We've got a situation in which meals are taken on the fly, in which people eat on the run, in which too many people eat standing up. That's the problem. And that represents the death of a cuisine, the death of a food culture. And it's because we now eat by default. We don't think about what we eat. We don't talk about what we eat. We just sort of eat as a way of prolonging life. But eating to prolong life is not a life itself. It's a means to an end. It should be an end in itself. And so when we think about having lunch from a vending machine, this is something that's very alienating, not only for our bodies, but for our souls as well. And so when we eat by default, pretty soon what we end up is outsourcing all of our cooking to stuff that's easy. Whatever is easy, whatever is quick. If you don't believe me, you can Google American food, and this is the image you get. And as you can see, there's a lot of brown in this picture. There's a lot of brown. There should be tremendous variety. So the tremendous variety that we had, the tremendous variety that led to the settling of the American continent has turned to brown. I think that's a very important metaphor. So if the American diet has died, what has happened? Who are the suspects? Well, first, we have to look for clues. Now, I don't love talking about obesity. Obesity is a very hot topic in public health. It's an extremely important topic. The problem with obesity is that if you adjust for diet and physical activity, obesity does not have large influences on health. It does not have large implications for lifespan, for disease, for other kinds of risks. Mainly, it's about diet and physical activity. The advantage of obesity, however, is that it is easily measurable. And what is easily measurable can be easily predicted. And so public health researchers have done these predictions, and they've looked at what will obesity look like in the United States in 2030. Now, as you all know, 2030 seems like a far away date, but it's actually not that far from now. Here's what it's going to look like. The states in blue will have obesity rates that are pushing 50%. That means that almost half of the population, over 40% of the population, will be obese. Not overweight, but obese. Okay? That figure is currently 1/3 in the United States, and it's growing rapidly, and it will reach almost 50% in the blue states. In the states that are yellow on this map, or kind of an ochre color, it'll be over 50%. It'll be up to 60%. So that's most of the country will have obesity rates that are between 40% and 60%, so right around half. But in the red states, the situation is even more grim. About 2/3, up to 70% of people in the red states on this map will have obesity. And that is a big tragedy. It's something that I think we all should think about, meditate on, and consider the causes for. So it's a mystery. What has happened here? The first step in analyzing any kind of suspicious death is to do an autopsy. And one of the autopsy results that has been shown is that it isn't just one food that's to blame. It isn't red meat. You often hear people demonizing particular foods, and red meat is the top of their hit list. Red meat by itself is not a problem. If it's part of a balanced diet, it's perfectly healthy. Eggs are not a problem. Eggs were demonized some time ago. Fortunately, they've been somewhat rehabilitated. But in fact, eggs are really not a problem. Wheat now is something that causes great fear among people. Wheat is not a problem by itself. And most ironically of all, I think, whole milk has been demonized. Now, in the Santa Monica school system, where my kids go to school, whole milk has been banned from schools. Ooh, whole milk is very dangerous, they say. Whole milk is a terrible thing. It must be banned from schools. Kids can't have any access to whole milk. Or even 2%. And in school districts across the country, whole milk and even 2% have been banned. They've been shown the door. All right? But the problem is, skim milk just isn't that tasty. Let's face it, it isn't very good. And so what do they do to get kids to drink milk? Well, of course, they add sugar. And so now what they have in schools is they have strawberry milk and chocolate milk and no whole milk. This, in a nutshell, is the death of the American diet. People are now drinking not wholesome milk, but a processed milk with added sugar and artificial flavors. That, in a nutshell, is the problem that we're facing in this country. That is a metaphor for our entire broken diet. And when we think about whole milk, or even 2% milk, being demonized, this is something that we have to stop and say, wait a minute, what's going on? Does this actually make sense or not? And so it's a mystery. It's a mystery because the science tells us that there's nothing about 2% or even whole milk that is bad for human health. Whole milk does not cause obesity. It does not cause weight gain if you drink whole milk. That's what's been shown in studies. So why is it that whole milk has been demonized? What's going on here? We have on our hands a mystery, a murder mystery. And so we've collected a number of suspects. It could have to do with prices, and I'm an economist, so of course prices is the first place that you would look. Could have to do with poverty, because when people are poor, poverty can drive them to lots of behaviors that are not optimal. Could be new technologies, microwaves, and Cuisinarts. It could be the effects of changing preferences, or it could be marketing. So let's look at these one by one. First of all, falling food prices. It may seem intuitive that as food prices go down, food consumption would go up. So that's one effect that economists would naturally reach for. when you see more and more consumption of calories, you might think, well, logically it stands to reason that if calories are getting cheaper, that's what's causing people to consume more calories. Poverty. When you think about the effects of poverty on individual decision making, you know that poverty can drive people to all kinds of behavior that is not optimal. Technology, with the microwave oven, the Cuisinart, things like that. The idea is that as food gets easier to prepare, people will prepare more of it, and so they'll be eating more and they'll be having less healthy diet. Changing food preferences. Now this is something that you hear a lot in the popular press, particularly from the food companies themselves. It's the consumers whose tastes drive the diet. That's what you hear all the time. So we have to think about that as a plausible suspect. And finally, of course, the effects of food marketing really does change what people eat. Now, as we look at each of these possible suspects, let's think through this about whether in each case there's the means, the motive, and the opportunity to have caused the death of the American diet. Now, by means, what I'm talking about is there a causal mechanism that would lead this suspect to change the diet? By motive, I mean, what's the logic behind this? Well, how does this work? How does this function within society? There might be a human motive on the part of particular individuals, or there might be some sort of a larger economic logic that's driving this process. And finally, opportunity. Are these suspects or these factors actually operating in the situation as we now have it? And so I've got this table, and I'm going to walk through this table cell by cell, and you'll help me figure out what's going on. So let's start with falling food prices. Now, it may seem obvious that as food prices go down, consumption goes up. After all, if the price of vacations goes down, you're going to consume more vacations. As the price of cars goes down, you're going to consume more cars. Well, maybe, maybe not. Maybe you would buy different cars. If the price of cars goes down, maybe you'd buy a better car. And so let's look here at what happens with body mass index, BMI. So that's a measure of obesity. What happens to BMI over time? And as you can see in this graph, from 1960 up till about 1980, there was a gradual increase in the effects of gradual increase in obesity. Then it accelerated through 1990, and it got even faster after 1990. Okay, so we're really talking about something that happened since 1980, and particularly since 1990. So what happens to food prices? Well, indeed, there is somewhat of a decline in food prices during this period, since 1980, but the decline is actually not very large. It's about 7%. Okay? So that is not a huge decline in food prices. It's a modest decline, and as you can see, there have been ups and downs along the way. But what happened in the period previous to 1980? That turns out to be very instructive, because what you see previous to 1980 is large changes in the food price, and yet very small changes in obesity. And again, obesity is not the perfect measure of diet, but it's a reasonable indicator. So if the claim is that food prices are what's driving the epidemic in obesity, that really doesn't hold water for the period prior to 1980. So this is not a very plausible explanation at all. So if we go back to our table, falling prices would not necessarily lead people to have a worse diet. You might think that falling prices could lead people to have a better diet, because some foods are now cheap, and so they can use the money that they save on those foods and buy higher quality foods in some other dimension. The motive is clearly not there, because there's no logic to this. There's no logic to why food prices would necessarily have an effect on the diet. And the opportunity is clearly not there, because food prices declined very modestly after 1980, but were wildly erratic before that time. So this is not a likely explanation at all. Now, what about poverty? Well, here again, we'll look at the same graph, and we'll look at body mass index over time. And as you can see, it increases among the poor. Okay, so this is something that we would more or less expect. We would expect that the poor have fewer choices. They have budgetary pressure to consume bad foods which are cheap. And so it's not surprising to see their obesity rates rising over time. Now, what happens to the rich? If poverty were the main explanation for the change in the American diet, we would expect that the rich would have no effects. Right? We would expect that the line for the rich would be much more gradual than for the poor. And so what actually happens? Wow. Now look at that. Now this, I think, is an amazing graph, and I hope that you'll remember it. Because what happens here is that the rich have a decline in their diet that's on par with the poor. So the same thing is happening across economic spectrums. This is not an isolated phenomenon. This is something that's happening to all of us. It's happening to the entire society. This is a cultural problem that affects everyone. It's not limited to one group or another. So poverty is clearly not the effect. It does have the motive in the sense that poverty can drive people to make decisions that are not optimal. But other than that, it does not have either the means nor the opportunity. Because if there's one thing you can say about the rich, it's that they're not poor. So that's a very unlikely explanation. Now, how about technology? Some people have said, and I'm sorry to say it's been some economists, that have said that as technology progresses, it makes it easier to cook food. And because it's easier to cook, you're going to cook more of it, and therefore you're going to consume more of it. So in the olden days, you would take your ramen noodles and heat them up on the stove. Now you pop them into the microwave. Since you can pop them in the microwave, why not eat 2 packages where you used to eat 1? In the olden days, you would steam broccoli on the stove. Very laborious process. You cut the broccoli up, you put it into the steamer, and you light the stove. Make sure there's a little water in the pan. But now you just pop them into the microwave. You cut the broccoli up, put some water in a Tupperware container, put that in the microwave, and press the buttons. That's less laborious, the argument goes, and so you're going to eat more broccoli. Really? I don't find this explanation at all plausible. I don't find it even remotely realistic. I don't see that it has the means to affect a change in the diet, or the motive, or the opportunity. If you think about a Cuisinart is going to give us the opportunity to eat better food. It makes it easier to prepare high-quality food. So this explanation doesn't carry any water, at least not for me. Now, what about preferences? Preferences indeed have a huge effect on what we eat. And they work in subtle ways. So there's one famous experiment in which the experimenters gave college students popcorn at a movie. But they gave them in 2 different size containers, a medium-sized container and a large container. And lo and behold, the people who got the popcorn in the large container ate 34% more popcorn, just because of the size of the container. Another study looked at people who were eating Hershey's chocolate kisses in an office building. And if the kisses were in a clear container, they ate a lot more of the Hershey's kisses than if they were in an opaque container. Another study looked at the effects of eating with others and found that people who eat alone have a tendency to eat less than if they have friends there who are egging them on. So clearly, preferences do matter, but they work in funny ways. And we don't necessarily understand all the different dimensions in which preferences work. So preferences, yes, they do have an effect on what we eat. It's not clear what the motive is. And the opportunity is simply not there. Because when you think about it, why should preferences have suddenly changed for no reason beginning in 1980? That doesn't make sense. So when food companies or others say that the problem of obesity is a problem of personal responsibility, I would ask, what happened to personal responsibility in 1980? Did people just all of a sudden start becoming irresponsible? I don't think so. I think there's something more. So I don't see that preferences by themselves have any possibility of having an effect. So that leaves marketing. Now, if you think about it, if you're thinking about having an afternoon snack, I could ask a whole bunch of people what they have for an afternoon snack, and I could construct a histogram. That's a graph that shows me, for example, how many calories people eat. And then I graph the height is how many people answer that number of calories. So a bunch of people have a 50-calorie snack in the afternoon. Maybe it's an apple. Some people have a 100-calorie snack. Maybe it's a handful of nuts. And some people have a large candy bar. That's 300 calories. That's a very big snack. But not many people are there. So we've got a bunch of people who are kind of in the middle, a few people who are off to the sides. And in the center of this graph, we have what statisticians call a central tendency, or what other people would recognize as a social norm. And that's, let's say, roughly 50% of people. But then we've got some people who are way out here, and they're the ones who are eating this giant king-size candy bar. Now, when somebody eats this giant king-size candy bar for their afternoon snack, a friend might come along and say, "Whoa, dude, are you really going to eat that?" Now, that friend is exercising a kind of pressure on this person who's eating the big snack. And that pressure is pulling, that's a social pressure that's pulling the person back. That peer pressure is pulling the person back toward the social norm. But there are pressures in the opposite direction, and that's the effect of advertising and other forms of marketing. And so that pressure is pulling the person in the other direction. Okay, so we've got two forms of peer pressure. One from actual living human peers and family and friends, and the other from food marketing companies that are trying to use advertising, especially television advertising, but other kinds as well, to pull you in the other direction. So marketing here definitely has the means, and I'll leave it to you to consider what the motive is. Does it have the opportunity? Well, so here, let's look at the effects of marketing since 1980. In other words, has marketing really changed since 1980? And I think the answer is unambiguously yes. We still have television advertising, and television advertising is very effective. We know that from very carefully done studies. But we also have new forms of advertising in new places. So this is a picture I took on an airplane. There is no more captive audience than somebody sitting in an airplane seat. And by the way, this was during the takeoff procedure when they do the, all of the buckle your seatbelt stuff, and you can't turn it off. Okay, so that is a captive audience. We've got marketing in different kinds of places. We've got new forms of product placement. Product placement is now a $3 billion industry. It didn't exist in 1980. Okay, E.T. was the first example of product placement with Reese's Pieces. So marketing does have the means, it does have the motive, and it certainly has had the opportunity. It's increased dramatically since 1980. We are walking through a food desert in this country. What used to be the bounty of American agriculture has turned into a desert. But it's not a desert where there's no food. It's a desert where there's fake food, processed food, food that is not only not good for you, but also is not enjoyable to share. And the reason why we have that is that we are being led by food companies who have a vested interest in making a profit off of the food decisions that we make. Money travels through the body toward power. Marketing is a form of power, and we are being led on this path by the food marketing companies. All right, so we know now who the culprit was in killing off the American diet. So what is the sentencing? Well, I think we should think not in terms of crime and punishment, but in terms of public safety and rehabilitation. So I don't want to demonize the food companies. I think they have a lot to answer for, but I also think they can be rehabilitated. And there are some efforts that the food companies are making to bring us better quality food. But I think we also have to do our part. I think that we would not sit still for food, for workplaces that were unsafe, for schools that were unsafe. Why should we have a food environment that is unsafe? So we all need to get out of the path. We need to get out of the line that simply follows the people in front of us that in turn are following the food marketers. We need to exert that peer pressure on each other, but we also need to stop paying attention to marketing. We need to get out of that line. We need to push the marketing aside, and we need to revive our food culture. And when we do, we're going to go from a food desert to a bounty of agriculture that we once were. We're going to return America to the promise that it initially had. And someday, when you type American food into Google, this is what you're going to get. Thank you.